Good afternoon, and welcome to the Ocean Future Society Virtual Film Festival live presentation and question and answer for Keiko Born to be Wild. My name is Jim Knowlton. I'll be your host. Thank you all for coming. The Ocean Future Society Virtual Film Festival is a new platform where you can see classic ocean adventures films like Keiko Born to be Wild, Keiko, Gate to Freedom, My Father the Captain, Jean-Michel Cousteau, and Swain's Island, one of the last jewels of the planet. In the past, you probably would have had to tune into a TV channel at a certain date and time to see these programs, and if you missed it, you might have to wait to see it again. But with today's technology, with being able to stream, we can now present these films anytime you want through pay-per-view on the Ocean Futures Virtual Film Festival channel. We hope that you will take advantage of this opportunity. Today's presenters are both were very involved with the Keiko Project to bring Keiko back to Iceland. And Jean-Michel Cousteau, president of Ocean Future Society, was executive producer and producer on the film. Charles Vinick was executive in charge of production on the film. He's currently the executive director of the Whale Sanctuary Project and was formerly chief operating officer and vice president for Ocean Futures. He's a member of the board and a trusted advisor to Jean-Michel and Ocean Futures. They will discuss the film, and at the end, we'll take a question and answer session. So if you want to ask questions of them, please feel free to use the question and answer section on the Eventive website where you can ask them questions. And then in the end, I will let them know what your questions are. So Jean-Michel and Charles, welcome to our live discussion.
Well, it is my pleasure and my privilege to reach out for all the people who may be listening to the presentation that we're making. I'm excited. And I'm happy to say that we're going to give you an overview of the Keiko story, that orca, which was captured for after 2 years of existence in Iceland, and then he was shipped to Canada, and then he was shipped to Mexico, and he was there in Mexico, and that's where the film Free Willy was created. And when people found out that Hollywood made everybody believe that Keiko was free, there was thousands and thousands of children who really got very, very obsessed about this. And they made the drawing and they made paintings. And that's when freedom and movement was born to return Keiko to Iceland.
Perhaps we could watch a clip from the movie Free Willy that kind of started this process all off in the first place.
Keiko became a movie star, and as Willy was freed to 10 million film-going children.
For me, it was an exciting time to get involved in the production of the show that we wanted to do with Ocean Futures and our team. And that's when I say hi to Charles, and I'm saying hello and invite him to say what he wants about his involvement with Keiko.
Well, hello, everyone. It's good to be with you, and certainly always good to be with Jean-Michel and Jim, of course. But, you know, in that clip, what we see, of course, is Keiko, and everyone at that point, all these children around the world knew him as Willy, and he jumps over a wall. And of course, he never did. he was still in a small tank in Mexico City. And when Jean-Michel and I had the privilege to become involved with him, he had by then been moved to a specially built facility for him at the Oregon Coast Aquarium in Newport, Oregon. And we got to meet the team of people who were already involved with Keiko and were beginning to work with him and to really try to help him become a robust whale so that the story that this film tells, Born to be Wild, could be made about. And so when you see the film, some of you have already seen it, others of you will be seeing as you're able to tune into the streaming of the film, you'll be able to see the actual full story of how Keiko was returned to Iceland. And we'll be able to tell you more about that as this session today goes on. But we really had a privilege of joining people who were already involved in this process. Experts in marine mammals, experts in logistics, people with all the skills to bring Keiko from Mexico City to Oregon, and then from Oregon on to Iceland. And so I think for Jean-Michel and I, it was a rare privilege to be able to be part of all of that process. And among the people who were instrumental in all of that certainly were the people who created the Free Willy Keiko Foundation. People like Dave Phillips, Naomi Rose was part of that process, as well as all of the people that came together on the funding side of it, and Craig McCaw's team. But what we were able to do really was merge the Free Willy Keiko Foundation with Ocean Future Society, and then together we carried that process forward, and I had the privilege of being kind of the manager of the logistics team and the like to carry that forward.
Well, we're having a problem.
I think we're still live, so we may just move to showing the clip of Keiko in Mexico City, and I think we're still live with that.
We can show his skin disease.
Yeah, we'll show a little bit about what he was experiencing in Mexico City and why that was the case there.
Okay, let me show some video of that.
So of course, Keiko was loved by everybody there, but you can see the skin disease, and it's really horrible what he had to do with this. And that really made a lot of people obsessed about it. And I think it's important to see the pictures of kids and their cards that they've written to return Keiko to the ocean.
And in a sense, before we go to that, I mean, that tank, what people need to realize is that tank was actually shallower than Keiko is long, and what his length was. And it was very small. So basically he could only go in circles swimming, and he couldn't ever dive. And what a lot of people didn't realize and don't realize in seeing the pictures was the amount of noise, because basically that tank was right next to a roller coaster. And so he was hearing all the time those sounds that were not at all sounds that were natural for him. So that skin disease we've seen, that papilloma virus, what was it caused by? It was caused by warm artificial water, caused by stress that he was experiencing every day of his existence over years of performing 2 and 3 times a day, as we just saw him in that small clip. And so that virus, really looks and is serious. And I think what caused so many children to write in, there was a story in Life magazine that really went around the world that brought people's attention to the fact that basically, as Jean-Michel said a few minutes ago, the film basically lied to us. We all thought he went free, but he was still there doing those shows every day and continuing to suffer in ways that people who saw the film Free Willy never knew. And that caused this outpouring of concern, particularly by children, as we'll see in this next clip. So here we've got a photo of children, and there were tens of thousands of children who sent in postcards, sent in letters, sent in their drawings, drew murals, as we're seeing here. And it's these children who made the story of Keiko possible. They drove all the rest of us who later became involved. They wrote to Warner Brothers. They wrote to the Humane Society of the US, that was a major part of the effort to move Keiko from Mexico City on to Oregon and eventually to Iceland. But without the children, none of this would have happened. And there were thousands and thousands of them who wrote these kinds of cards and letters to Keiko and basically called the attention of the adults to the plight of this whale.
And that's literally, that's when we've decided at Ocean Future Society to do a show. And that show is called Keiko Born to be Wild. And that was a major experience and adventure for us to literally see what was happening to him after he was born and in Iceland and moved to different places. And ultimately, we saw him being moved to Oregon. And that's when we started the filming of Keiko. And that was a very, very important time. And it was, in my opinion, very important to know that and to see what was happening. And the photo of team in Iceland is very important, and we want to share that with you.
Let's see the title shot of the film and in a sense bring that to everyone's attention so they're seeing how we first saw that film come to life and how we then became involved. Title shot, you're able to see the contrast between that small tank in Mexico City, artificial salt water, to a much larger facility built specially for Keiko in Oregon, with natural seawater pumped into it much deeper, where he could swim longer distances, he could dive, and the team that we met could then be engaged with him to train him, if you will, to go wild. And think about that for a minute. Here we're talking about trainers who, in many cases, have been brought up in the captive industry. They're training whales, or they know how to train whales to do tricks. And here, in some ways, they're having to learn how to untrain him and help him become wild. So it's not only a story about the whale, but Keiko Born to be Wild is also a story about all the people who were involved and what they had to learn in order to learn how to have a whale go wild. I mean, it's just an interesting, complex set of experiences that we had a privilege of being part of. And we initially started that to make the film, as Jean-Michel said, and then we were asked to get more involved in the day-to-day management of that process, and had the privilege of working with Keiko and working with that team for really the next 4 years. So maybe we could see that photo of the team now, Jim, and talk a little bit about some of them as well.
I think it's very important that we give it a chance for the public to see that team and realize that these were unbelievably dedicated people who some of them spend the whole time from Oregon all the way to Iceland, where ultimately Keiko will end up. And these people are still involved today, trying to help for any marine mammals in captivity and to help Charles for making sure we do everything that needs to be done. It's a very, very exciting time. And we can show Keiko in his Oregon team in the ocean, or in, I shouldn't say the ocean, in captivity, having to learn freedom. And that's a very exciting time. And maybe, Jim, you can show that video, and Charles can tell us about what these people are doing for those people, for this amazing creature.
So in this clip, we're really seeing that Keiko is being, if you will, introduced to live fish.
He was given a lot of fish, but he didn't know they were for him to catch and eat. They were playing with them like with toys.
Eventually, instinct or learning
And
takes
what's
over.
amazing is that
Keiko begins to
ultimately
catch half of his food live.
he was able to catch them
He is
and
taking
start
one
to eat
step
them.
closer.
So he was learning part of freedom.
As Jim said, Jean-Michel saying the first times he brings them back to the caregivers and kind of gives them back. But over time, he really learns that they're fish, and he then begins to eat them on a regular basis. And that was a major part of his training, because if you're looking ahead to having him be free on his own with other whales in the wild, he would be eating 100, 125 pounds of fish a day. He's used to being fed frozen fish. It's pretty easy to be eating when they're given to him. Now he has to learn to catch them and spend some of his energy to go chase them and taste them and figure out what a live fish tastes like and develop an appetite for them. So that not only started in Oregon, where we were just seeing in that clip, they're doing it in Oregon, but that process continued in Iceland until a point where he was eating a good portion of his daily 100, 125 pounds of fish a day from wild fish. And that was a major learning experience for him, that he basically had to prove to his caregivers that he could catch the live fish and eat them before he was ready to spend full time out in the wild.
Well, the team, the scientists wanted to know how much Keiko could eat and what he could catch. And it was amazing to see that some of those people who took care of Keiko every day, was trying to find out if he was able to catch other things than just fish. And there's a video, and you may want to look at it.
And part of what we're seeing in this next video, of course, is how Keiko was introduced to the kind of environment he would see as he moved to Iceland. So you'll see here now in this large tank, not only were there fish being thrown in,
just the fact that when I come in here and come upstairs and can be in a bad mood, can be in an off mood, and all I have to do is come upstairs and I jump in the water and play with this animal and everything just goes away.
The crabs Keiko has learned to play with so gently will soon be replaced by other creatures who have no way of knowing that it's just a game.
And there we're seeing Steve Clausen playing with the crab and showing him that and so forth. So, over time, what the team did in 2 years in Oregon was to introduce Keiko to the kinds of critters he would find, to the different environments he would see. So they put seaweed, they put all kinds of things in the tank to get him ready for that. But simultaneously, he was getting stronger. He gained 2,000 pounds in weight while he was in Oregon. He grew 7 inches. And even his bent dorsal fin began to lift a little bit because he was swimming more and was more vigorous and was swimming not solely in a small circle. Because the dorsal fin is primarily bent in captivity because whales are spending their time on the surface. And therefore, gravity pulls their dorsal fin down. Now, occasionally you see it in the wild. Jean-Michel and I actually saw other whales in Iceland, 3 of them with bent dorsal fin. But that's really rare in the wild, and it's common in captivity. And so basically over that 2-year period, Keiko was strong, he was robust, and that papilloma virus that we saw in the clip from Mexico City disappeared. And then a panel of veterinarians came and evaluated his health, determined that he was healthy enough to actually be moved back to his home waters in Iceland. And that was kind of a poignant moment for so many of the people who'd worked with him for these years in Portland, in Oregon, in the Oregon Coast Aquarium, not in Portland, but in the Oregon Coast Aquarium. And this next clip kind of shows us some of that poignancy.
You got a new one, didn't you?
Many people and some favorite toys he will leave behind.
Well, I'll miss him, but it's the best thing for him. That was the whole purpose of this from the very beginning, to try to give him back the life that he deserves. It's a wonderful dream, and I think it can be achieved. I really do.
You feel you can stay objective about that?
Oh, certainly, certainly. A lot of people are going to miss him. He's been a great deal of a lot of people's lives for a long time.
So this woman and so many others would spend time up on the border, if you will, on the gateway around the tank, but also at that window in the evaluation room. Keiko would come and spend time with them, and they became completely connected to Keiko. And yet at the same time, they realized that if he was to live the life he was meant to live, he had to leave Oregon and go back to his home waters. So they were very emotional. I think we were all very emotional on those days that it got close to his being put into a C-17 and flown to Iceland. But that was what was important for him, and basically to prove and to help us prove that a whale could be returned to his home waters. And that's really what this story, Keiko, Born to be Wild, is all about. It's a story about how do you help a whale who's been in captivity for really the great majority of his life. Keiko was some 22 years old when we flew him to Iceland. He'd been in captivity for 20 years, captured at the age of 2, and knew nothing really but a life in captivity. And we got to experience what it's like for him and what it was like for us to try to change his life and help him become a wild whale as he was born to be. And that's really what this story is about, and what this next clip shows us as he's able to be released into Icelandic waters for the first time.
To me, this amazing journey is the result of enormous dedication to correct what has been done to this vulnerable whale. For nearly 6 years, millions of people have dreamt of this moment. This is the best of our own species, committed to an idea far bigger than ourselves. Not just to one whale, but to the hope that we can restore some parts of nature and of ourselves.
Well, Keiko is now back into where he had been caught in Iceland. It was a very, very emotional experience, not only for the entire team, but after we released the film, a lot of people were very, very concerned about captive animals and what needs to be done. And I'm happy to say that we never stop trying to do what we can to make sure that captive marine mammals like Keiko can be returned or educated to rediscover freedom. And we've learned a lot from Keiko. We've learned thanks to the team, and Charles was so involved and continued to be involved with many of the people who were there to help Keiko. And I'm happy to say that we will not stop and we'll continue. And there's a lot more to come about learning about Keiko, learning to be back into freedom, into the open ocean with other orcas. And that will lead us to show many films, of course, like we want to do in the future. But Charles, I'm sure that you want to add something to this because you've been so emotional about this whole issue that you never stop and never will stop for the rest of your life.
You know, it's a remarkable experience to have worked with the team and be part of not only the making of the film, but all of the work that went into helping Keiko go out back into the waters of Iceland. And in many ways, not only was this a story about Keiko, but Keiko became an ambassador for all orca and in many ways for all cetaceans in captivity, because this became a story about Keiko's transition from captivity to being a wild whale again. And he had a robust number of years, probably a total of 5 years, swimming out in the wild that no other captive orca had ever experienced before. And so out of this story came a tremendous amount of interest. And as Jean-Michel has just said, we learned so much. You know, we just 20 plus years ago, in 1998, when that clip would have been of Keiko being put in the waters really on September 8th, 1998, September 9th. We left on September 8th in the plane. We landed on September 9th. And so when he was being put back in the waters, people then didn't know as much as we know today about how whales and dolphins, cetaceans suffer in captivity. Today, there are, all kinds of movements for all land mammals as well as the mammals in the ocean to no longer be in captivity and have the opportunity to be in as close to a natural environment as we can provide. So with Jean-Michel as an advisor, a number of us have created the Whale Sanctuary Project, where we're looking to create sanctuaries so that whales and dolphins that are in captive environments can be put in an environment that's as close to a natural habitat as we can possibly provide. So that's some other work that's going on. And as Jean-Michel says, whether it's Ocean Future Society or the Whale Sanctuary Project or others, we're all committed in part because of the story of Keiko to try to do better for all of the animals that have been in these captive environments. So with that, perhaps we can respond to some questions if there are some, Jim, and keep the conversation going between Jean-Michel and myself, or certainly as we respond to questions from those of you who are watching these clips. And keep in mind, we've only shown you a few highlights from the film. You got to watch the whole film to see the story. And so that's what this film festival really allows you to do. At your convenience, you're able to stream Keiko Born to be Wild and the other films that Ocean Future Society is putting on their film festival.
Thank you, guys. Great discussion. There are some questions coming in on Eventive. And the first one from Carolyn is, how many years was Keiko in Mexico?
Well, I'll jump in and respond to that. Keiko, as Jean-Michel said at the outset, when we started half hour or more ago, mentioned that Keiko was captured in Iceland. He actually spent a couple of years in a small tank in Iceland. Then he was moved to Canada, to Marineland of Canada. And then he was sold to Reno Aventura in Mexico City. And he spent, I believe it was 6 or 7 years there before he was moved to Oregon.
May I jump in?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, I want to jump in because, I know that he was in a very small tank by himself most of the time. And it was artificial salt water because in altitude in Mexico City, and he was eating frozen fish that were imported to feed him. That's how he started his life. It's horrible.
That's great. So someone asked, how did you get Keiko to Iceland?
Well, I can start that and Jean-Michel will join in, but the interesting story is that, what we needed, because the Oregon Coast Aquarium is in a small community. So there needed to be a plane that could take off on a small runway. And then Keiko's home in Iceland was also on an island off the south coast of Iceland in the Vestmann Islands, the island of Vestmannaeyjar, the city of Jaime. And that too had a very small runway. So you needed a plane that was large enough and had the capacity to go basically transatlantic as well as across the US, but the ability to take off short and land short. So one of the only planes that could do that was a C-17, the largest transport plane in the US fleet. And this was the only time that the US Air Force leased a plane to a private organization, to the Free Willy Keiko Foundation, and they deemed that it was in the interests of the United States to allow a military plane to be used this way. And we ended up air-to-air refueling twice. So we took off with very little fuel so that the plane would be light, air-to-air refueled as soon as we got up to altitude over Oregon. And then before we left US airspace on the East Coast, air-to-air refueled again to take on enough fuel that we could get to Iceland, but not so much fuel that we would be too heavy landing on the short runway in Vestmannaeyjar. So that was on a C-17, and that too was quite an experience and a lot of fun and unusual for us because it was real cold because they had to keep the aircraft cold for Keiko as well. So that was a fun and a good experience for us. Jean-Michel, what do you want to add to that one?
Well, I want to say that it was an amazing experience, and I'm very grateful to the officials in the government who made that happen. And it really allowed us to be part of a miracle. And I was with you and the whole team on the plane, and I watched that plane being refueled twice, which was amazing. And we filmed all of that, and we ended up in Iceland, and it was such an exciting experience, which of course will be part of our second show. And I hope that the people will want to see it.
That's a great answer, and it's a well-told story in the show as well. So if you want to see the actual plane flight and the members in their cold weather gear, foul weather gear in the plane, it's in the show.
Well, in that clip in the film, you'll see, when you get a chance to see it, you'll see what it took to take care of Keiko on the plane, the special kinds of equipment that were needed in order for him to be safe during that journey. So all of those are part of the stories in Keiko Born to Be Wild that you'll be able to see when you stream the film if you haven't already.
Yep.
So moving on to other, here's a question. How many orcas are in captivity today?
Well,
Charles, you would know that.
today there are, to my knowledge, 57 orca in captivity. There are a little over 300 beluga. And total, in terms of orca, beluga, and dolphins, there are over 3,000 cetaceans in captivity around the world.
What about whales?
Well, the whales, as I say, the orca, there are about a little over 57. I think I heard recently 59, because there may have been some births in captivity. And then belugas, there are over 300.
And to further that question, Charles, how many countries have made it illegal to capture killer whales, and how many countries have not recognized that need for protection? Do you know?
It's a growing number. I don't actually have the number of countries that have made it illegal. It's really interesting. Canada passed a law in 2019 that basically forbids either keeping or breeding whales in captivity. Interestingly enough, the US does not have such a law right now, although certainly no whales have been brought into the US in some 2 decades. But we don't yet have a law, although there's talk of one being proposed in Congress this coming year. And so Jean-Michel and I had the privilege last year with an international team of going to Russia and working with the Russian government and Russian activists to have 97 whales, 11 orcas and 86 or 87 belugas returned to the wild that had been captured illegally for sale to Chinese marine parks. And that international team, with Russian government support, and particularly the Russian activists, was able to create an effort that was successful in returning all of those whales to the wild. And the Russian government at that point, even in their case, began to consider legislation to prohibit whales being captured. Now, that legislation has not yet been passed, but we're all still working on it. So we're seeing around the world a growing effort to no longer allow whales to be kept in captivity, but there's a tremendous amount of work to still be done to make that a reality.
Here's a question that builds off of that, Charles, by Anthony. To either of you, I know you were involved in the rescue of the belugas and orcas kept captive in Russia. Will there be a documentary on that? And how did that repatriation go as far as you know?
Well, I could jump in and start a little of that. Certainly, as I just mentioned, they were all released. The orca were returned to the waters where they were captured. About 30 out of the 87 beluga were returned to the waters where they were captured, and the other 50 were released back into waters that were a little more southerly. And because they were in the wild, not all of them were tagged, certainly, and so we don't know where all of them went. There were certainly this past fall some belugas seen in the area around Vladivostok. Some appear to be those same belugas, others may be different. So they're continuing to be watched, but that's truly a success story of releasing all of those whales. There are a number of people working on short films and longer films to document that experience. To my knowledge, none of those films have yet been released, but I know that they will be. But for Jean-Michel and me, and the team we were able to bring together, that too was a remarkable experience to be able to work with the Russians that closely on this issue.
Here's a question. Was Keiko trained to not perform as part of his release?
Now, that's a really interesting and good question, because first of all, training someone not to perform in itself is an interesting question. But, part of the challenge in experiences like this, and it's a challenge for the caregivers, for the caregivers and for the people working with the whale, you have to have enough engagement with the whale so that when he needs to respond to you, he's still capable and willing to do so, while at the same time, you want him to be independent and autonomous. And those two things are somewhat at odds with one another. And so, it's interesting. Our protocol in Iceland with him, and you get to see this in the next film, the film Keiko Gate to Freedom, which is really the 1 hour story of those 4 years in Iceland. And you'll see that. But there you see that we take him out and he learns to go on what are called open ocean walks. So he has to follow a boat. Well, at that point, he's being responsive to the trainers. But as soon as he interacts with wild whales, you don't want him to be responsive to the people. So our protocol was that we turned off the engines. And if he approached wild whales or they approached him, we basically stayed silent. And by silent, I mean the engines were off, because when you turned on the engines, that was almost like a signal to Keiko to join the boat and to come back. So we would just drift away and let him do what he wanted. But that question embodies the challenge of how you have to work with him so that he has enough independence to experiment with the open ocean, but at the same time, we have enough connection to him that if he needs us or needs to rejoin us, he's able to for his care and his health. But that question really captures the challenge of helping a whale go wild, to be reintroduced to the wild.
I was fascinated, and to answer that question or part of that question, I remember being out there on the boat when we turned off the boat, and Keiko would go and he would approach other orcas, and something happened where he was very, very unhappy and came right back to the boat. And there are other times where he went, found another group of orcas, probably different ones, and they were kind of friends and stayed together for a long time. So it was interesting to know that communication, see, our primary sense is vision. Their primary sense, I believe, is acoustic. And that's how they can either like each other or not like each other or speak the same language or not. But to me, it was fascinating to see that happen there. And we filmed it. It's part of the show.
Yeah, very much so.
Here's a question. Did Keiko's health improve from Mexico to Oregon and then in Iceland?
Well, his health improved remarkably. I mean, it's just an incredible story. As Jean-Michel mentioned, he's at, 7,000 feet of altitude in a warm, artificial saltwater, shallow tank in Mexico City. He goes to a much larger facility with cold, natural seawater being pumped into it in Oregon. And in Oregon, he gained 2,000 pounds in weight. He grew some 7 inches, as I think we mentioned earlier, and he became healthy. And veterinarians came and inspected and evaluated his health and signed off that he was healthy enough to go to Iceland. But at that point in Iceland, he still didn't have the stamina to spend the kind of time that he would need to with wild whales, because they swim 100 miles a day on occasion or more. And so he had to learn, and basically, not unlike marathon training for one of us, a human who trains to go on marathon runs, that's what part of those open ocean walks were all about. Initially, taking him out, training him to follow the boat and to go ahead of the boat, 2 knots, 4 knots, bursts to 6 knots, enable him to gain the strength to be able to do that kind of swimming every day. So all of that is part of the story of that next hour, The Gate to Freedom, where you can see all of this in the film.
What amazes me, just to give an idea of what happened toward the end, I was amazingly lucky to be with one of the team members on a boat, and we were looking at Keiko. With my better half, we were there, we were looking at Keiko, and he was with other whales. And we knew, because the scientists that morning had changed the battery, and he had a way of for us to identify his presence where he was. And we knew that he was diving, that he could feed himself, and he could stay a long time underwater. And he was sometime going down pretty deep. And we saw him with other orcas, and they got together. And that was on a Sunday, I will never forget. And we saw him leaving with the orcas, and I never saw him again. And there's a story to follow Keiko. We knew where he was every day, and he was feeding. But there is a long story about that.
There is a question here by Lauren, who says, will there be a third film released that covers his last few years in Norway?
Well, I think, as Jean-Michel was just alluding to, where he swims from Oregon to Norway, some 800 plus miles over a 3-week period. And as Jean-Michel mentions, he had a satellite tag. And so every morning at 8 o'clock, we would get a reading as to where he was along that journey, and we're able to follow him. But I don't think at this point there will be a film made of his. It was basically a year and a half that he was in Norway. And to my knowledge, there won't be a third hour based on that, because I don't think the footage exists to create that film. But certainly the story is well known. He was able to come and go as he wanted in a fjord in Norway. There were a number of caregivers. Some of the team members who were with him in Iceland were moved to Norway, and they cared for him there. There wasn't as much live fish in the fjord, so they provided food for him. They provided care, and he could come and go as he chose to. But basically, people ask all the time, was this a success or wasn't a success? Did he live his life with wild whales and the like? And for those of us who were part of it, I think without any question, this is a remarkable success story. Keiko is the only captive orca who ever had the opportunity to live his life out in the wild, in a wild environment for all of those years. So were we successful in helping him join a pod for the rest of his life? Well, no, he didn't join a pod and live with them for the rest of his life. But he did experience getting back with wild whales. He traveled, certainly on that day Jean-Michel saw him, he was in the company of wild whales, wild orca, and he was traveling with them. We know from the satellite tag readings that he was diving to 300 feet on that journey. In all of our training, we never got him diving deeper than 50 feet. We had no way to do that. But yet, by satellite, we know he was diving much deeper. He was clearly capturing fish along that journey for food. So he had a wild existence, more wild than any other captive whale ever. And in that sense, this was completely successful. And it led to so much more for so many more whales. So it's not only a success story for him, but I think his ambassadorship has led to all of these efforts for other orcas and other whales that are in captivity as well.
Excellent answer, Charles. Here's a question similar to that, is who paid for the transportation and tracking of Keiko?
All of those children that sent in $1 and a dime and 20 cents and more, they paid for it. Well, realistically, they brought it about. The kids made it happen. But certainly there were a number of significant donors. Warner Brothers started off and contributed greatly. The Humane Society of the United States contributed extensively. Donors to the Free Willy Keiko Foundation and eventually to Ocean Futures as well. And certainly the Craig McCaw's family. Craig McCaw Cellular was instrumental and without a doubt, the most significant donor to make this story possible. But many, many people, as well as help from governments, help from the Icelandic government in many, many ways, made it all possible financially. But without the help of Craig McCaw and his former wife, Wendy McCaw, this story would not have been able to have the resources that were necessary to do something this expensive.
Here is another question, and I think it relates to a really interesting issue. I don't know if it's reasonable at this point, but has there been any study to pinpoint Keiko's family retroactively, or was it ever confirmed or not if the family with the flopped dorsal fins were related? And I think what's really interesting in that to me is the issue of the flopped dorsal fin that was thought to be a trauma due to being in a pool. But as I was in Iceland as a cameraman and sound man for filming, we saw live or wild orca that had flopped dorsal fins, which caused us to question whether it was really because of the pool or if that happens in nature as well. But do you have any thoughts on that, Charles?
I have some thoughts and some science. So I have a little bit of both. And one is, one of the things that we were clearly interested in doing is seeing if we could identify Keiko's family, because we certainly knew he was captured in Iceland, and therefore his family was likely still there. So one of the ways to test for that was to try to get DNA samples. So among the science, and there was a lot of science conducted throughout all of these years, but among the science was collecting DNA. And with that DNA, we had Keiko's DNA, finding whether we had a family match. We never did find his family through that DNA matching. We did get some DNA from the wild whales that had the bent dorsal or flopped dorsal fins, and they were not a DNA match to Keiko. So we knew they were not his immediate family. So, okay, where does Keiko's proclivity, if you will, for a bent dorsal fin come from? Does it come solely from captivity, from some other feature of his makeup, his physical makeup and his familial background? That part we don't know. But as Jim said, we saw wild whales with bent dorsals. As we mentioned earlier, that's rare in the wild, but it exists. But it's very common of animals of orca that are in captivity.
If I may jump in there, I'd like to say that there are orcas everywhere in every ocean of the planet. Not millions of them, but they are everywhere. And they sometimes travel from the northern Pacific down to the southern Pacific, which is very unusual for that species, for marine mammals. And what's amazing, and I've had the privilege of traveling in most of the oceans of the world. I've seen orcas with bent dorsal fins everywhere on the planet.
That's great. It is now 3:59, and this has been a wonderful conversation with both of you. I appreciate both of your time and insight into Keiko Born to Be Wild. It's a pleasure to work with both of you. I want to let everybody know that there are the other films on the platform, and if you haven't seen Keiko Born to Be Wild, it's available as well. Our next live presentation and Q&A will be January 13th for Keiko Gate to Freedom, which is the story of when Keiko starts his time in Iceland and his learning how to exit the Bay Pen and go on ocean walks with boats. So I hope you'll get a chance to see that, and we'll see you all back in January. You guys all have a great holiday season.
Thanks very much, Jim. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.